Hi, Indra. It's nice to see you today, and it's really a pleasure to be interviewing you today for the LIFT project on leadership for transition, about politics and the future of politics. And both you and I are part of this LIFT project, and normally you're the one doing the interview, so I feel really honored to be able to be asking you the questions today about what it is to be a pioneer in politics at this time. So just as a brief introduction, maybe you could tell a little bit about, what do you actually think in terms of politics? And I should mention that you're the co-founder of the Alternative UK initiative, which is not a political party. But what I find is that the Alternative is like one of my favorite websites to go to for inspiration on another way of organizing ourselves. So I feel really like curious to hear, like, how do you look at politics?
Thanks, Karen. And I'm really happy to be in conversation with you, actually. I think a lot of what we've been discussing over this past couple of years of doing this LIFT project has been really well framed by your own book. You matter more than you think. So just to give you a really quick introduction to how the Alternative came about, that's probably helpful. Mm-hmm. So I was part of the progressive left for 10, 15 years. I was part of a think tank called Compass, and I even stood to be an MP for the Labour Party in the UK. And this is very much my kind of grounding in politics. And but before that, I was also working in the fields of conflict transformation, and I spent a lot of time looking at the concept of soft power. So soft power, as opposed to hard power, it's really an American concept, but it looks at if hard power is coercion, guns and money, then soft power is kind of attraction. And how does influence occur? And what is the role of storytelling and narrative building? And so I've been looking at those two things as a kind of a framework, if you like, for a new politics. And in addition to that, I'm a psychotherapist. So I've been deliberately, some people might say, why do you operate in so many different fields? And it's deliberately so that I can understand what for me is the core thing is, how does the human being connect to the society or the community in which they live, and what is the impact of that upon their world, right? So all the time I was working within the progressive politics structure and culture. I found it quite hard to bring this kind of, which I thought was a very natural and logical way of looking at power and agency. I found it very hard to bring that into that conversation, which was more to do with a kind of economy that was more instrumental and transactional. It had more of the idea of a human being as homo economicus embedded in it. And it was altogether more, mechanistic, and possibly, something to do with the fact that the system was designed by men over centuries. And it took me a while to sort of really feel and sense that what I was bringing or trying to bring to this world was something that was more feminine and interconnected and interdependent than the way that politics was being looked at and talked about. But the real trigger for me was when, so I spent a long time in this field critiquing it from sort of the edges. We need to change the language. We need to change what we're talking about. We need to have an emotional resonance here. All of these things will just keep falling flat, except sometimes they would be weaponized or instrumentalized. Like, yes, we need a new emotional politics. And then suddenly, every campaign was full of emotional language, but not emotionally literate or interconnected or any of those things, and certainly not empathic or intuitive, which is what I was trying to bring into the space. But the trigger, as I was going to say, was very clearly for me that having spent actually right at the end of my time in politics, I was introduced to Uffe Elbæk and what he was doing with the Alternativet in Denmark, which seemed to me like just a ontologically, if I'm allowed to say, an ontologically different kind of politics. It came from an idea of energy and creativity, and this was a very human pursuit, and everybody should be involved. Uffa's history of working with the chaos pilots, which is all about how to generate a new economy through entrepreneurship and, the creativity of human beings being at the heart of the matter. I had been long nurturing this feeling. I want a bit more of that, alternative energy in my politics. And then just a week before Brexit, which is, as we all know, I'm sure everybody's listening knows, has been a really painful, chaotic, period of time for the UK. But it really came to a head for me a week before when Jo Cox was murdered. So to me, that seemed like, the absolute, the apotheosis, if you like, the proof that the politics that is built on dividing people against each other, that structurally, culturally, this only leads to the worst of people and to the possibility of violence is always there. And if the possibility of violence is always there endemically in our politics, where do we go from there? Kind of division, and in the UK, I don't know how obvious this was to the rest of the world, but in the UK, not only were we divided along classical lines of, maybe class divides were present or culture divides were present, but the real thing that was so challenging was that the divides were now appearing within communities and within families. So ingenious, if you like, was this framing of, that we need to get away from something, that it appeared everywhere in everybody's mind, that there was something I was trying to get away from. I needed to take back control of something. It was just, it was purely an emotional campaign, one that really played on our inability to feel autonomy, which was so, in a sense, the right thing to play on, because that is where we are, but it just translated into nothing but destruction of communities and families and people against each other. So when I saw that, and I saw the helplessness of all of us in the face of that, we could do nothing ultimately except find ourselves in these arguments we never intended to have. And so I jumped ship at that point. I said, whatever it is that I'm going to do next, or that we're going to do next, it's not that. I've got to step away from that.
So you were inspired by a pioneer in Denmark, and then in that context of the situation in the UK, which is really shared with many other situations around the world where we have a politics that just doesn't really work for organizing a society that meets the challenges of like climate change, inequality, poverty, all of these different things. And so you decided then to set up the Alternative UK, but not as a political party as in Denmark, but as maybe you could say something about that.
Yeah, I mean, if we'd started a party, which of course seemed like the obvious thing to do, and so many people have done that. Over 90 groups have set up parties since Brexit. So they're proliferating everywhere. But if you understand the British political system, there's no hope for that, right? If you think about the fate, for example, of the Green Party, which has 5 million votes, and the MP that used to lead it at that time, Caroline Lucas, was the most popular MP, regularly voted, but she had one seat in our parliament because of the first past the post system that we have. So some will see this as completely archaic, that we still have a system that doesn't allow proportionality. So many votes are really wasted in this, because you may as well just choose between the two main parties. Whatever happens, they're going to win. Everything else is really wasted.
So it's the structure that is the problem. It's not who people are voting for, or what people want.
Yeah. And I think we felt, and also having looked somewhat at the fate, of Alternative Ed in Denmark as well, that now you're obliged to take part in the system. I think when you're outside the system, there's some sort of sense that you could change it. And to some extent you can keep this narrative going, But once you're in it, you are obliged to give your daily life and energies to that old system. And I had no intention of doing that. I said, I just didn't want to do it. I'd already stood to be an MP in the old system, so to speak. And it was a really, it was an unfriendly experience, let's put it that way, and not very human, unfriendly experience. So what we do now, and I can say it now in hindsight with more clarity, but at the time we were just feeling our way along. But we now do clearly three things. We look at the importance of generating a new narrative, right? So only 2% of people in the UK are members of political parties, and that, by the way, is common across the whole of Europe. The highest percentage is Austria, I think, which is 5%. But so only 2% of people think it's worth their time and effort and money to commit to being a member of a political party. But that 2%, constitutes the entire political discourse. Out of that 2% is all the stuff that the media feeds on that they call politics. So everything we're hearing about politics is coming from a very small amount of people.
And we call it democracy.
And we call that democracy, yeah. So, so language, and the language is very important. So we decided to commit ourselves to looking at what's going on in the 98% from the viewpoint of what kind of future could be arising outside of the political bubble. And so every day, and then we have a weekly newsletter, we're looking at one aspect of the change that we see happening, that, like the blind men and the elephant, we're looking at something that's arising between all of these things, this new system. So that could be something to do with personal development, it could be social community development, but it also could be this interconnected global development, and what we call, cosmo-localism. I'll come to that in a second. So that's one thing we do. The second thing we do is we actively seek out system changers who we sense are on the same page, looking at this new interconnectedness, and we try to drive collaboration between them. So we hold events, and we create opportunities for people to meet each other and try to build this system. And then the third thing we do is we are actively helping and constructing and identifying what we call citizens action networks on the ground, or we call these CANs. And the reason they're called CANs is because it says we need a container for our action, right? The internet is full of immense possibilities, we know that, and there are millions of projects with a lot of potential, but without a container of some kind, they can't meet each other and have traction. It's all the energy is dispersed too widely. But the CAN is an idea that from the community level, working actively at the global level, so these small systems of change can be contained within something. And we call them either citizens action networks, or they could be community agency networks. People have adopted them in so many different ways. They even have become creativity, artistic networks. But everybody gets the idea of the CAN. And once we started seeing that this was necessary, actually what we saw was that it's already happening. So we're not really the creators of a new system. We're trying to pick up on what is going on.
So you're not coming in there with a solution, and you're seeing like what is.
Yeah. It's like, yes, and seeing what's been undervalued or not being given enough attention to, so that we can, identify this new system arising. So CANs are happening everywhere. A good example would be transition towns in the UK, which bring together the health of the human being, of the land, of the planet. It's a very holistic, these are very holistic entities. Also eco-villages, but also sometimes I have to say, football clubs are like this. We've come across very interconnected football clubs. There may be mostly men there, but they're taking on in their own way social problems, anti-racism, teaching technology, creating learning clubs. They're doing a lot of this work in their communities, and then they're connected to the families, that also come into the space. So I find, these CANs exist in many different ways.
And I think that's really important because, basically what you're saying, like we talk about systems as if they're huge, but systems can be a football club. Systems can be just a community, like very very small things. And it brings me to the question of what you've referred to as fractal politics. And I think that really resonates with me, because we're really talking about creating new patterns and breaking with these patterns of the past, because we know that that all the institutions and things have been designed for just another era, and they're not like fit to meet the challenges of today. So could you say something about how you see fractal politics as playing this role in large-scale global change?
Yeah, it is actually core to the question of how can change happen, because too often what you'll see is that very promising groups of people moving into completely new relationships with each other for the first time get very discouraged by the idea that nothing is happening, because it's just a small, tiny thing. But the fractal nature of it sort of recognizes that all change happens in a fractal way. In other words, it's the shifting of relationships between things and new patterns that emerge that, in two ways. One is that you notice them happening everywhere. And the second thing is that in the era of the internet, they get copied very quickly. So if you've got a new something that is working, it causes a lot of attraction, because it releases a new kind of energy around it. And through that attraction, people pick it up, and the internet is perfectly designed in a way to allow that to happen very rapidly. So fractal change is more emergent and pretty fast, very different to the notion of scaling up. So scaling up always implies a sort of central body, some sort of set rules for engagement. And then actually what happens is it gets imposed upon things, so here's the model, follow this. Whereas what we're saying is that these new patterns of relationships are actually people coming back into a relationship with each other that they've been denied for a long time. It's kind of to do with the waking up process, right? So there's a waking upness at this point, moving into new relationships, and then suddenly seeing that's happening everywhere. And
I think that brings in that, like, the individual values and your psychotherapy background, because if we just say that somebody's going to fix it up there, then we end up with, you get corruption, you get oppression, it doesn't become a healthy relationship. And when you talk about like how important it is to wake up, to be able to, see the system, see yourself as part of it, it makes me think of your forthcoming book, The Politics of Waking Up. And so maybe you could say something about that, because I think it's as having had a sneak peek of it, it's a fascinating story of everything you're talking about, but just how it all fits together in what I think is a very optimistic way of looking at a different type of politics.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm very conscious that we're living in a sensitive period to this idea of waking up, because it's happening very rapidly, or it appears to be happening very rapidly, but it's causing a lot of conflict as well. But I just want to put it in a slightly bigger setting, because I think we've been waking up for 20 years, and that it's very logical when you think about it, that if before the internet we were pretty disconnected, and because we were disconnected, we couldn't share our anxieties and our thoughts and our emotions as easily as we can do today. And that made us much more prone to be instrumentalized, if you like, by the system that is driven by the growth economy, that has been destroying our planet. So in a way, all of us have had the chance, and I say all of us, of course, I'm not excluding the knowledge that only, I think about 60% of people can have access to the internet globally. A lot of people still don't, but they're still in a way being shaped. Their futures are still being shaped by this interconnectivity, even if they don't have direct access to it. So we do have to pay attention to what's going on in this energy source. And so let's think about it historically as, at one point we had no access to information, not only research, data, learning, but we didn't know much about each other either, right? Because where do you meet really, where do you even meet yourself actually in a public space? And what happened very rapidly over the first 10 years, and then even more rapidly in the second 10 years of the internet, was that all of this was quickly connecting. Suddenly, not only did you have access to information, but you became the person who could be generating information. So you're putting stuff onto the internet, you're being reflected all over the place, you're watching yourself perform. It's this incredible revolution of awareness going on, and not even knowing what it is that's happening to you in the process. So I think that this is inevitably, if we look at it back, from 50 years back to this time, we'll know better and understand better what a moment of absolute chaos that was for our minds and for our bodies, but also that we had to manage this somehow. The idea that it's simply chaos was not enough, and it doesn't really talk to us as human beings. Ultimately, we're going to be trying to manage this chaos, and that's really the really important thing to think about over this time, that somebody, if we are not ourselves trying to make sense of this chaos, somebody else is doing that for us. That's kind of the soft power battles, if you like, that are going on.
Yeah, and that's really created that social dilemma that we have of that, fake news, or the echo chambers we see, and everything. And so, how do we get around that?
Yeah, but the social dilemma made it very clear to us that that's what happened with Facebook. It happened with Twitter. It's happened with Instagram. And they've conveniently called out, the people who they feel are responsible for this. But it's not actually the case. We've been subject to, to being shaped and manipulated all our lives. If you think about the advertising industry, if you think about propaganda, if you think about, it's never been the case that we haven't been shaped in the public space to think something.
Yeah, and I guess that is that socialized mind that, and now algorithms are doing it for us.
Yes, and some people are doing it very deliberately. We can think about socialization as something that is inevitable. We have to find our way in the public space as children becoming adults, etc. But some people are doing it very deliberately. They're shaping us into giving us the mindset that simply complies with their agenda. And that's been happening all the time. We did a long-term project called the Peace Journalism Project in the 90s, just looking at the media, for example, around war. And, when the Kosovo War occurred, we were looking at how much the media simply prepared us for war all the time, and never prepared us for peace, actually, or never really gave us the peace options. They were never there. That's somebody's agenda. That's the agenda of the military-industrial complex, and of the establishment as we know it. So I'm not going to go too much into the way we've been shaped all along. It's too big a conversation. But just to know, it's not simply Mark Zuckerberg. That's not it. It's the fact that we ourselves cannot take responsibility for our own agenda. We haven't been able to understand that we're not telling our own story about how we want to see it. And that's really the challenge now. Taking back your own mind, taking back the story of your own community, and taking back your future, actually. It's a narrative project.
And that really brings in the whole concept of agency, because I think right now, like with, for example, in environmental issues, everyone is trying to change other people and not unleashing that capacity of everyone to be an agent of change. So how would you describe like that sense of like, what does it take to kind of wake up a sense of political agency?
Well,
your experiences with communities and football clubs.
It's a complex mixture of, it's a new thing and it's an old thing, right? So the new thing is that, to create a new idea of where the power lies, is is a challenge. You know, if you really believe that you are powerless as an individual, that the only way of expressing your power is to vote every 5 years, it really minimizes your ability to change the system from yourself, or from your, you know, from your idea of how, you know, of what future you'd like. So that has to be really reconstructed as a system, right? So in my book, and you know, I see this occurring around, I don't think it's simply a question of transforming the party political system. We, in fact, need almost like a parallel system that allows humans in society, in community, to start to generate their own narrative, free of that old system. Now, that's not to say, and you know, that obviously it has some anarchic potential to it, so to speak, but it's not to say it's going to move out of relationship completely with that system. It needs to be in a partnership. So the way that we're thinking about it is, you know, community action or community agency networks, cosmo-locally, developing a new idea of the future that they want, and how it impacts the planet, working in good partnership with the old system that is still constructed to give us our services and to collect our taxes and so on. But unless it's a parallel system, then all the energy of this new human-centered kind of organizing will get just sucked up into the old system. And I see that happening all the time. So you get great community initiatives. They sort of ask the council for help. The council sucks it up, you know, and makes it its own thing, and makes it into a party political campaign.
Yeah, really, when you talk about that energy, it can just really dissipate all energy in this, because you become part of that bureaucracy that you were going against, and you have to find funding and all this, and you end up being that part of the system, or just having to, you know, create enough money to keep a staff and survive. And it's very self-defeating. So.
Yeah, and I really want to say I'm not anti it. It's just historically we got to be able to give a new orientation, a really quite strong new orientation. So I see this as a parallel system. Vaclav Havel, I think, anticipated this kind of parallel system when he had his communities of artists and so on, literally trying to create a new vision and imagination of the future. So something along those lines. But the other part of it is that it was always thus. Right. So if you think about communities and how they've actually managed to hold themselves together despite everything, and that there are these endemic, you know, care systems, relational systems, somehow on a certain level, it's been held together all along. And then it has a direct connection and a language which brings us back, which makes it easy to recover indigenous wisdom, you know, and a more spiritual conversation. And one of the things I feel that's core to that is the role of women, and how women have always been able to talk in a certain way that implies our connectedness, but also acts, you know, for our connectedness. So our care systems, I say, these ideas of relational networks, you know, it's really a shift, as I say, of orientation. If we were just to say, this is politics, actually, you know, where the personal is political, you know,
and
if
political is personal.
And the political is personal. You know, if we can make that shift, enough of us, then you could say it's already there, this parallel system. But it's obviously much more to it than that. And I love the conversation that happens in municipalities around the feminization of politics, which tries to bridge these two, you know, the shift that needs to happen. So men acknowledging the role of the feminine, which is really radical inclusion. It's nothing much more than that. Being human as humans, amongst humans. The feminization of politics becomes quite core to the shifting narrative of politics.
Yeah, and I think that brings in, it brings in like that issue of values, and, you know, who's in your circle of care? How wide does it go? You know, does it actually include, you know, all humans, all other species, future generations and things? And I think that that's like when you start to just become aware of where you're drawing your lines and who you're othering, it becomes clear to see, that line actually exists. But when we don't talk about it, it's we just pretend like that it's nothing.
Yeah, absolutely. But and oddly, I'm glad you brought in the word values, because often values are weaponized as well.
Mm-hmm.
So people would, I hear time and time again that the people move, people who come together are people who share values, right? But they often miss that this can create a bubble.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, we all agree this, don't we? Or we all agree this. It happened a lot in the UK around Remain, as if being a Remainer implied a certain set of values.
Yeah.
But it also implied that we're not the same as those guys, right? Because they think something different. And a lot of that is false, I have to say.
Yeah. Well, I think that is, and then, like a value statement and values, that like it's what's important to you, but it also has to be like what's important to others too. So there's a way that, and maybe that isn't even the right word, but just that what is innate to us as humans, which I think is that where that connection is, where our entanglement lies, where our and that we express it through stories, through words, through meaning making. And I think that's where it becomes really exciting, because it's not that we don't, the internet is a really great thing, but we are connected anyway, and we've always been connected. And going back to that indigenous knowledge, to have a relation with with each other and the planet, then you start to shift, because you wouldn't do you wouldn't like pollute the water, you wouldn't pollute yourself, you wouldn't, like there's a lot of things that we would just go like, wow, why did we do that? And then that, so, going back to your book on the politics of waking up, it's just kind of like to be able to continually have those aha moments where you go like, wait, why are we organizing society like this? Why are we doing this?
Absolutely. And I really recommend people read your book, because it's the way that you bring these things together, and even give it a scientific basis, to me is absolutely core. And when you the only thing I would add to our conversation would be to say some people simply would never consider it, right? Talking about values, or they just wouldn't move into the conversation, because there's something that has prevented them from doing that.
Does that go back to the masculine, feminine type of thing, or?
I'm not even sure. I think there's a lot of factors to it. But for example, let's just be practical. When we worked building these citizens' action networks, what we find is there's three groups of people, right? There's the usual suspects. That's us. Right, we talk about this stuff. We've given our lives to this. We're the usual suspects, and then just outside of that, there's the people who are traditionally excluded from our conversation, and sometimes that's a cultural thing, and sometimes it's a gender thing, and there's all sorts of reasons. But there are people just on the edge who've been excluded until now, because they've just not been invited into the conversation enough. So in the UK, that's a lot to do with I'm not going to go into it, because I don't want to make it too heavily political. It's a big conversation, but we know what we're talking about: excluded people, right? And then there's another layer beyond that, who are people who will never maybe be in the conversation directly, because in their minds, they don't care about it. They're not interested in this kind of conversation. Sometimes deliberately so, they reject it. Or sometimes that they just feel uncomfortable and have never developed the language and feel. And something about the way we design what we do has got to include those people, right? So when we're building citizens' action networks, we're remembering that some of the people we want to reach are not going to be reached through conversation. They might be reached through, inviting them to something that's physical. Like a festival will draw in more people, or food projects will draw in more people. Or,
what matters to them, basically.
Yeah, do you know what I mean? And we won't be talking about what we're talking about here, but we will still be acting together. We'll act, we'll do stuff together. And then slowly a new conversation about our togetherness arises. And in our case, sometimes we've even had to offer free stuff. If we're trying to make a conversation or hope a conversation happens that's diverse enough, we've offered free stuff. We've pulled people in through paying them, all sorts of ways, because we want their voice in the room, and not to judge it from a values basis, but to just have the desire to see people there.
Yeah, but I think that is like that recognition of shared humanity, and recognition that that somebody might not be interested in the same thing as at that certain point, but that we're all like processes, we're all like in this process of becoming. And so how do you actually meet people and rather than like that, this idea, which I also kind of like, who are these people and everything, recognize like, wow, these are people. And I guess that becomes that a real challenge in a political system where we have very old structures and we're trying to kind of keep them, like that maybe like in the United States, the way that the political system has developed, it doesn't represent the majority of the people anymore. And so but until you can make those reforms, is the option to have the parallel system, or is it to actually like empower more people to change the system from within? So what is that like, within, without, or maybe it's not both and, or maybe it's not either or, but both and.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other part of the, when I think about creating the citizens action networks on the ground, I imagine I can see myself building something, and any of us could be building this thing. But the other part of it is this conversation we're having in our head, and the conversation that we can have with each other exactly in a space like this. And then this idea of a parallel system disappears, because really it's just us. It's just it's me and my story about what's going on. And I really enjoy, there are many initiatives, websites committed just to this conversation, being in dialogue with others. Of course, they're curating that room. We should, let's not kid ourselves that we're not curating a room, but how we curate the room becomes our act, our act of creating a future. So, but it's happening really in the conversation rather than not necessarily in a building structure or a piece of architecture that people can see. It's our experience of change. So a lot of the conversations that I see happening amongst men, for example, many deep, long, protracted conversations between men about what it is they're experiencing, a lot of sense making. They probably didn't intend it as a men's only space, but you'll see that it's populated by a lot of men. Seems to me an important part of the process that we're in, wherein if men designed the old system and they've been benefiting from it in a certain way, they're now talking through or trying to develop a new sensibility for the thing that's coming through. Obviously women would like to be part of that, but maybe that's another stage of that conversation. But right now, I see a lot of men making sense or making new sense of what is possible, finding new language that they can own. It's obviously an important part of the process.
Do you see big like generational differences? Because as a educator, I just, I feel that like young people today are able to integrate these different dimensions so much better than, as you say, 20, 30 years ago or anything. Do you see in terms of politics?
Absolutely.
There's a
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've got young ones of my own, and I always have to be thinking about how I phrase my work to them, because quite often if I'm thoughtless about it, they'll come back at me as if I'm way behind the curve, and part of that would be this kind of gender conversation, for example. They haven't experienced it, many of them, in their growing up. That's not to say they're not enjoying their own levels of being different and being specific, but they don't talk about it the way we do in this kind of binary ways. It's much more fluid as a conversation.
Yeah, spectrum.
Yeah, and they also don't have the same hesitation around the real and the virtual. They're more comfortable around moving easily between one and the other. And then the final thing is they have have very little hesitancy about operating in a global space, or across cultures, because they've been led, by a music industry and an arts industry and a festival industry, and a work industry that is quite global all the time, and they expect to see many different kinds of people in there. It's to some extent, I'm not being too idealistic about that regeneration A, because they're still emotional human beings, and and have the same needs as we have, but also they're probably coming from a very privileged point of view. The ones we know, especially coming from the North and the European conversation, we're very privileged. So the idea that we know what it means to be African, for example, or Chinese is probably just an idea. It's not really true, right? We don't know yet. But they're more up for the fluidity of things and the emergent nature of things. It seems to me then they're less hung up on the things that I was in at their age.
Yeah, and maybe that's a good place to like shift our conversation, because I think we're both interested in large scale change at the because we know that if you take the science seriously, we actually don't have a lot of time to really to get things right. And when you see like the military coup in Myanmar, and the resistance, the civil society standing up against the military, or in Hong Kong, in so many countries, Belarus, where you have that political agency that we're not going to take this anymore, and really standing for something that is much bigger than the old structures want, and yet, in terms of who has power to just to shoot people, and to really maintain the status quo in those old structures. And there's that tension between people really wanting to create change and old structures that are constantly oppressing violently.
Yeah. I mean, it's very easy, isn't it, Karen, at any given time to read the newspapers and feel it's impossible to change this. I feel the powerlessness of it, even when you're reminding me of these things that are happening. But I would say that even since the Arab Spring, let's take that as a marker, even since the Arab Spring, or actually just before that, even since Occupy, the possibility of change has evolved quite a lot, right? So with Occupy, and then again with the Arab Spring, I'm only bringing them into some sort of relationship with each other because they were still protests, people bravely putting their lives on the line in protest against this hard power regime, right? And mentioning the 1%, and this idea that our political agency really lies in protest. But what was obvious in Egypt and in Tunisia, and in all of these rising countries, was that there was no infrastructure on the ground to take on the next step. There was nothing to take on the protest. It was simply the old system still waiting to follow it up again, right? So that's really what I'm trying to point at for the need of this parallel system. If we're not building our own capacity to build the new, then any protest against the old will be wasted. Because the old will not give us the thing that we're looking for. It may improve a little bit, it may try to satisfy the voters a little bit, just so they can continue to be voted in. They may bend a bit to global opinion, but that's not the change we need. We need, rapid systemic change towards a new future within the next 9 years. We've got a time frame, right?
And there's that sense of urgency of okay, then what do we do? And so what I hear you saying really is about through these cans, through communities, is this really this fractal approach where we're actually, it's not like the answer is here and we need this ism to replace that ism and everything, but really that it's really a relational approach to change, but
yeah, no, absolutely. So it's, you know, each person committing themselves in a way, or making them feeling responsible, you know, and use the word, you know, response able. If you don't feel response able, then it's an education, it's a sort of being involved with others, evolve yourself, consciously evolve yourself. But we really need to shift attention to the thing we're trying to make, not the thing we're simply trying to oppose. That's a very important shift in my view. So let's be builders, you know, let's design the architecture. We're in a hurry here to build something new that we all feel we can be, we can find our own agency in. And the more this grows, right, the more it begins to shape the other side of the system, you know, the old system, because ultimately there is a need for the old system to satisfy the people. You know, it's just until now the people, or people power, has been hijacked into something that we recognize as populism, which is nothing more than jerking people around really emotionally. We need to reconstruct populism as solidarity amongst people.
Yeah, that's beautifully said, because I think that is that then you realize that people are the solution, they're not the problem to these things, and that really the unleashing of our full potential for like connecting, for actually like that creative potential that we have.
I mean, on a day-to-day basis, moving into relationship with others is the radical act, in my view. That, you know, and notice what it does to you. It creates new worlds of possibility. That's, to me, is the quantum shift that you're describing in your book. You know, it's not simply a line between two people, it's worlds meeting worlds. You know, and when more people feel that, there's more and more rising up, but the rising up needs to be in a constructive, building, you know, imaginative, but practical set of, you know, of actions that actually make change happen.
So if somebody came up to you and said, you know, just like, you know, there's no hope for the future, I don't matter, you know, like I give up, this is you know, this is just, it's too late, what would you say to them as you know, from the perspective?
You know, it's almost a psychotherapy question, Karen, you know, because a lot of people do say that. You know, and you know, I'm mostly inviting people to observe the story they're telling themselves in their head, and why they invest in that story, because usually there's a reason for that. You know, and to develop a practice of observing the self, and then a practice of reaching out to others. You know, so the practice of building cans, for example, is therapeutic. You know, when you move into spaces of empathy and sharing and then achieving stuff together, it's therapeutic. So it depends, of course, how much people are willing to become responsible for something. But there are many, I mean, we publish the Daily Alternative specifically, you know, to create new worlds of possibility. And I have actually prescribed people, you know, go off the mainstream media for a month and only read, you know, the Daily Alternative, for example. I'm not saying I'd say that to my patients, but my clients, but, you know, but I would say it to a troubled activist, for example, and see how your mind changes. You know, just try it out, because people are not aware of the effect that their mind is having on their whole body and their actions that they're taking. They think it's objectively true. They have no idea that this truth space is constructed.
Well, that's great. Maybe I'll do that myself, because I think also that like all the things that are happening in the world, they're not really part of the whole script that we're being told in the media, and it's almost like it's like this. It's almost like kept invisible. But when you start to think about all, like in Paul Hawken's book Blessed Unrest, that there's just you know, there's millions and millions of people who are really working for a better world, and yet we don't always hear about those stories, or we hear about the bad. The bad rather than the potential. And I think that being able to recognize that social change isn't this like linear process, but that it actually, as you kind of, you know, said from the very beginning, like that you create these attractors that suddenly become like, oh, did we ever do it differently than this? So
Yeah, absolutely. Things can change so rapidly. It's a bit like falling in love. You first you're attracted, and then there's different stages, but if when you're deeply in love with something or somebody, then your whole world changes. You think and feel differently. You're in this relationship with something else or somebody else, and it has its highs and lows. But you couldn't have imagined feeling like that until you were in that space. And I just want to draw attention to it's just a scientific, to encourage people to understand the function of the dreaming brain. That we all have this dreaming brain, and we're constantly looking and searching, for relationship and information. And we are almost always in trance of some kind, right? As soon as you're reading a book, as soon as you're watching a film, as soon as you're talking to someone, you're in a semi-trance trying to download information for this body that wants to get all its needs met, emotional and physical. So just be aware of that. What do you give your mind to? What are you giving yourself to day by day? And then there's some aspect of choose. Choose. What are you choosing? You can choose. Your real power lies in that. To pay attention to things that you would like to know more of, that you would like to be informed by, rather than imagining that you don't have a choice in that. You do. Ever more so with the internet.
Yeah, because I think it comes to these issues of then like, who is, if you're not deciding who is, and collectively who's deciding the future for us. And that that brings us then to even like the issue of visioning that future that we want, and who's the we. But so when you think about the future of whether in the UK and globally and everything, are you optimistic about it? Are you pessimistic? Are you on the where do you think the that sweet spot for change really lies? And how, if you could say like, okay, this is where I'm going to put my energy in the next 5 years.
It's a good question. I mean, optimistic is itself a tricky word, because what could I be optimistic about? Is it about, do I think the world's going to turn out fine? Or is it that when I think about my life and the life that's ahead of me, am I going to enjoy this life? Right. And I feel optimistic about that, because I feel as if at this point in history, I'm really lucky to have seen the possibilities that exist right now in a certain way, that I can see my role in it. I can see that the people I love, and the people I care about, or that the world itself could emerge could transform in a certain way. Maybe not within my lifetime. It's not an idea of arriving at that. It's being on the journey of that is really, it's a life of creating a certain kind of value. But I want to be more practical, because I wouldn't want to leave people with the impression that I'm just being airy-fairy in some way, and it's all just in the imagination and just how you feel. It's not. Real systems are being built right now. And the combination for me, the magic kind of combination, is these cosmo-local communities. The promise of technology, right? Which, if we are successful in owning this technology, which is not a small if, it's a huge one, but in many ways, there are opportunities for ownership of the technology and how it develops, could really lift things to another level. But we have to be obviously well connected to that. And then this promise of a much more prevalent feminine leadership, which also includes females. It's not only feminine in a gender neutral way, but also with a lot of females implied. To me, those things add up to something very new. And if we look, for example, at the next economies that are coming forward, so the donut economy, Kate Raworth, the well-being economy, the circular economy, these new economies are showing their colors now and moving into relationship with each other, the fourth economy, you know, it's a real translation and a real transformation of our material world as well as our feeling world. So, and all of those, by the way, including, I'm now going to mention Elinor Ostrom as well, and her fashioning of the global commons, a lot of powerful female actors creating new realities, which doesn't exclude anyone. You know, it doesn't exclude the men. It's about the men as well as the women. It's all about the whole fluid situation. But it's real. It's actually real and coming into being. It's not a hope and a dream and an imagination.
Yeah, and I think that too is just like to ridicule or to say, oh, that's just utopian, oh, that is actually like a way of maintaining the status quo, just by saying that potential is so unlikely or whatever. And I think that you're like, what I think is really important is just to actually show that there are alternatives. And I think the Alternative UK really does that beautifully, and to just show that these are happening. This is here and now. Join, you know, be part of this. And I think I get it for my dose of inspiration to say like, yeah, we're not alone in this. And I think to me, that's the work that you're doing on the politics of waking up, which should be coming out this fall.
No, it should be out in May. I mean, it should be out in May.
Oh, great. The Politics of Waking Up by Perspectiva Press.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, so that, I highly recommend people to read that. And the alternative.uk, or alternativuk.org.uk, is that the?
The alternative.org.uk.
Okay, that's the alternative.org.uk. I get that right. Yeah. So, and I think that we'll just wrap up there. But I feel like we could have conversations because you know, these are the conversations that matter these days. So, so thank you so much, Indra Adnan, for joining me and for the Lift Pioneers of Politics project. And
thank you in turn, Karen. And I'm just going to do the plugging your You Matter More Than You Think books too.
You matter more than you think. So
because you matter more than you think. No, thank you very much. It's been enjoyable.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye.